For 5 years, Elias Vance had a conversation with the mountain, and for 5 years, the only thing that answered was silence. He'd come to this high, lonely place in the Colorado Rockies to let his life end. He'd built a cabin with his own 2 hands, not as a home, but as a tomb. A monument to the wife and son that a fever had stolen from him. Every day was the same. Chop wood, check traps, hunt, survive. He was a ghost, haunting his own life, a man whittled down to bone, muscle, and a grief so heavy it cast its own shadow. He had forgotten the sound of another human voice. He wanted it that way. He thought this was how it would end, in the quiet, in the cold, alone. He was wrong. One afternoon, as the sky turned the color of a deep bruise, the silence broke. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a ripple in the air that told him he was no longer alone. He straightened from his woodpile, axe in hand. His mule, Cain, let out a nervous bray. And then they came out of the trees, not one person, but 7. All women. They were Cheyenne, their clothes torn, their faces carved with an exhaustion so deep it looked like it was part of their bones. They moved without a sound, a procession of ghosts walking out of the forest and into his life. An older woman with silver in her hair led them. Her eyes were hollowed out, like she'd already seen the end of the world. The 6 younger women followed, their expressions a mix of fear and defiance. They stopped at the edge of the meadow. Elias stood frozen, his heart a cold stone in his chest. His sanctuary, his grave, had just been breached. The old woman met his gaze from 100 yards away, and in that one look, Elias Vance felt the world he had so carefully buried begin to tremble. The mountain held its breath. For the first time in 5 years, the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. The old woman took a step forward. Her hand was raised, palm open. Peace. Elias didn't move. His mind raced. They were running from soldiers. He'd heard the stories at the trading post, stories of a world he'd left behind. Now, that world had found him. He deliberately leaned the axe against the woodpile. He would not show welcome, but he would not show a threat. He was just a part of the mountain, a rock to be walked around. She stopped 20 feet away. Her English was broken, but her voice was clear. "We have run far," she said. "Soldiers took our men, our camp." Her hand swept eastward, indicating a world of fire and loss. "We are 7. No food. Winter comes." Elias said nothing. Silence was his weapon. Let her talk. The woman's pride was a force you could feel. She wasn't begging. "They say a white man lives here, alone, far from the towns." Her eyes searched his face. "We do not ask for help. We do not ask for shelter." She paused, and the words she spoke next were so strange, so impossible, they hung in the frozen air. "We ask you to decide." Elias blinked. Decide what? The words felt like rust in his throat. "Our fate," she said, and the simplicity of it hit him like a physical blow. "You can tell the soldiers. They will find us. Or you can let us go." She pointed a thin hand toward the towering, snow-covered peaks behind his cabin. "We will walk into the high country, to the spirits." It was a death sentence, and they both knew it. There was no third option. They were asking him to be their judge, their executioner, or the man who simply watched them walk away to freeze to death. He looked from her face to the 6 younger women huddled together, their eyes fixed on him. He had come here to escape the weight of other people's lives. And now, 7 strangers had laid the heaviest burden of all right at his feet. He, Elias Vance, the ghost of the mountain, was being asked to play God. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his cabin. He opened the heavy door, stepped inside, and shut it behind him. But this time, the silence inside wasn't his. It was theirs. It was listening. And outside, in the falling dark, 7 women waited for his judgment. Inside the cabin, Elias stoked the fire, his hands moving automatically. He couldn't think. It was madness. Decide their fate. The words hammered at the inside of his skull. The easiest thing to do was nothing, just ignore them. They would eventually give up and walk into the mountains to die, just as they said. His life would go back to the way it was. The thought gave him no comfort. It just felt like shame. He looked around his small, dark cabin, a single cot, one chair, the empty pegs on the wall where his wife's dress used to hang. This was a place for endings. What right did he have to order the end of 7 more lives? He walked to the window. They hadn't moved. They were statues in the twilight. The wind picked up, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. The mountain was making its own decision. A sigh rattled his whole body. He couldn't send them to their deaths, but he couldn't shelter them. He had just enough food for one man, just enough space for one, just enough heart for one. But the look in the old woman's eyes, he saw his own grief reflected there. With a curse that was half a prayer, he grabbed his lantern and coat and stepped back into the storm. He didn't walk toward the women. He walked to the barn. He swung open the doors. The smell of dry hay and his old mule rolled out. He lit the lantern, its light pushing back the shadows. It wasn't much, but it was better than the wilderness. He walked back and held the lantern high. They watched him, their faces unreadable in the flickering light. He stopped in front of the old woman. "The barn," he said, his voice rough. "There is hay. It is dry. Stay the night." He didn't offer food. He didn't offer comfort. Just 4 walls and a roof. It wasn't a rescue. It was just a delay. The old woman, whose name he would later learn was Vavina, nodded once. She spoke to the others in their own language, and they followed her to the barn, a silent procession through the swirling snow. The youngest one, a girl with fire in her eyes, gave him a look of pure hatred before she disappeared inside. Elias pulled the barn doors almost shut, but he didn't bar them. He went back to his cabin and bolted his own door. 7 people were in his barn. 7 lives were in his hands. He sank into his chair by the fire. The mountain was no longer his alone. The first few days were a war of silence. Elias moved around his property, always aware of the eyes watching him from the barn. He left water and smoked meat by the door every morning. It was a transaction, nothing more. The women were like ghosts. He'd catch glimpses of them gathering firewood, always moving together, a silent, self-contained world. Then the snow began to fall, and it didn't stop. For 3 days, a blizzard buried the world in white. The mountain passes were gone. The outside world ceased to exist. They were all trapped. The mountain had made the decision for him. They were here for the winter. The reality of it forced his hand. That night, as the blizzard howled, he found himself making a huge pot of stew. He didn't know why. He just did. He bundled up and fought his way through the storm to the barn. He pushed the door open. A small fire burned in the middle of the floor, and the 7 women were huddled around it. The young one with the angry eyes, Mesa, jumped to her feet, grabbing a heavy stick. Elias ignored her. He walked to the fire and set the pot down. "It's cold," he said. It was all he could think of. He turned to leave. "Wait." It was Vavina's voice. He stopped, his back to them. "You have a name." It felt like giving up a piece of himself. "Elias," he said. "I am Vavina," she replied, and she named the others. Mesa, the angry one. Neva, the quiet one. He didn't catch all the names, but it didn't matter. They were no longer just refugees. They had names. He nodded once and left, the wind slamming the door behind him. The weeks turned into a month. The snow was deep, locking them in. They were running out of food. One morning, Vavina came to his cabin. "We hunt," she said. He looked at the rifle he was cleaning. "You know how to use this?" "No," she said. "Our men hunted, but we know the forest, the tracks. The signs. Better than you. There was no pride in her voice, just fact. You have the weapon. We have the skill. Together, we eat. He didn't want to agree, but his empty stomach did. He took Vavina and Mesa with him, and he learned quickly she was right. They moved through the snow like spirits. They saw things he never would have. A faint track, a broken twig. He taught Vavina how to use the rifle. She was a natural. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp. But it was Mesa who spotted the elk, a lone bull on a high ridge. It was a long shot. Elias prepared to take it, but Vavina stopped him. Let me. He saw the determination in her eyes and stepped back. She lay in the snow, just as he'd shown her. She breathed. The rifle cracked. The elk fell. It took them all day to haul the meat back, the three of them working together, their shared exhaustion forging a bond that words never could. That night, for the first time, they ate in his cabin, crowded around his fire. The silence was still there, but it was different. It was the silence of respect. A few days later, Elias was chopping wood when the axe slipped. It opened a deep gash across his palm. Blood poured into the snow. He wrapped it in a rag, but he knew it was bad. In this cold, an infection could kill him. He was sitting by the fire, staring at his bloody hand, when Neva, the quiet one, appeared at his side. Before he could protest, she gently unwrapped the rag. She looked at the wound, then left without a word. She returned with a small pouch and a cup of steaming water. She made a dark paste of herbs and bark and cleaned the wound with a shocking efficiency. She packed the paste in, and it stung like fire, but then a strange warmth spread through his hand, and the pain dulled. She wrapped it in clean cloth. "Keep it dry," she whispered, the first words he'd ever heard her speak. She changed the dressing every day. The wound, which should have turned rotten, healed clean and fast. He looked at this quiet woman and felt a sense of awe. He had given them shelter. They were giving him something more. They were giving him healing. He started to see them, not as a group, but as people. Vavina told him Mesa's husband and son had been killed by the soldiers. That's where the fire in her eyes came from. One night, he found himself telling Vavina about his wife, Martha, about his son. The words felt strange, pulled from a place he had locked away for years. When he finished, she didn't offer pity. She just said, "Your ghost is strong. She watches over this place." Then she began to hum a low, soft chant, a song of remembrance, and Elias felt a piece of the ice around his heart begin to crack. But their fragile peace was about to be shattered. On a clear, cold morning in March, he was checking his snares when he saw them. Two men on snowshoes crossing the meadow toward his cabin. They weren't soldiers, they were trappers. A cold dread washed over him. He was no longer just protecting himself. He ran back to the cabin. "Inside," he said, his voice low. "All of you, be silent." The women vanished into the cabin without a sound. Elias stood by the woodpile, trying to look casual, the axe resting nearby. The men swaggered up. The leader was a big, bearded man with mean little eyes. "Howdy," he boomed. "Name's Garrett." Elias just nodded. "We've been tracking a rumor," Garrett said, his eyes scanning everything. "Heard some Cheyenne women broke from the reservation, headed this way. You seen anything?" "I see no one," Elias said. "I live alone." The other man, Owen, laughed. "Alone? That's a mighty big pile of firewood for one man." He pointed at a fresh elk hide stretched on a frame. "And that hide is too big for one man to handle before it froze." He took a step closer. "We know they're here. There's a bounty on 'em, a big one. We'll even share." Bounty. The word made Elias's blood run cold. These men were predators. "There is no one here," Elias repeated, his voice dropping. "You've wasted your time. Head back down before the weather turns." It was a threat. Garrett's smile vanished. He looked at Elias, then at the axe. He was weighing the odds. "All right, friend," Garrett said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "We'll be on our way, but we got long memories, and we'll be back." They turned and walked away. Elias watched them disappear into the trees. He didn't relax. He knew this wasn't over. Their greed was a powerful thing. They would be back, and they wouldn't come back alone. The world had found them, and it was coming to burn their sanctuary to the ground. The days after the trappers left were heavy with awaiting silence. The peace was gone. Elias turned the cabin into a fortress. He barred the door, boarded the back window. He cleaned his rifle. He cleaned the old pistol he hadn't touched in years. Inside, the women prepared for war. Mesa practiced with a bow she had made, her aim getting deadlier every day. Neva prepared bandages and medicines. They had been victims once. They would not be victims again. Elias and Vavina planned the defense. He knew the guns. She knew the strategy. He gave the pistol to Mesa. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were like chips of black ice. "They will come at dawn," Vavina said one night. "It is the way of cowards." He knew she was right. 3 days later, they came. 4 of them this time, dark shapes moving through the pre-dawn gray. Garrett and Owen had brought friends. "They're here," Elias said. The women were already in position. The men spread out, thinking they were attacking one man. They were about to learn how wrong they were. When they were 50 yards out, Garrett raised his hand and let out a yell. It was the last sound he ever made. Vavina's rifle shot cracked like thunder. Garrett staggered, clutching his shoulder. The other 3 dropped and returned fire. Bullets slammed into the log walls. The cabin filled with the smell of gunpowder. Elias fired from the front window, reloading with frantic speed. A cold rage made his hands steady. He was defending his family. Mesa fired the pistol. The shot went wide, but it made one of the attackers move. Elias took the shot. The man fell. Owen screamed and charged the cabin. An arrow whistled from a crack in the wall and buried itself in his leg. He howled and collapsed. Mesa's bow. The 2 remaining men, including the wounded Garrett, took cover behind the woodpile, pinning them down. The air was thick with smoke. Then a lucky shot shattered the wood by Elias's window. Splinters tore into his side. He cried out and stumbled back, the rifle falling from his hands. Pain exploded in his ribs. He felt the warm stickiness of his own blood. The world started to go gray. He could hear the men outside shouting, getting ready for the final rush. He had failed them. But as Garrett and the last man stood up to charge, the cabin door flew open. Vavina stood in the doorway, the rifle at her shoulder. She fired. The last trapper fell. Garrett, alone and wounded, froze. Before he could raise his gun, Mesa was on him. She moved like a panther, a long knife in her hand. She didn't scream. Her movements were a blur of pure fury. Garrett made a small, terrified sound, and then he was silent. The ringing quiet that followed was more shocking than the battle. It was over. The battle was won, but the war for Elias's life had just begun. He drifted in and out, feeling gentle hands cleaning his wound, smelling the sharp scent of Neva's herbs. He opened his eyes and saw Mesa's face. The hatred was gone. In its place was a fierce, protective gratitude. "Be still," she said. "The bleeding has stopped." Neva tended his wound with a devotion that humbled him. The other women took over his chores, nursing him with a tenderness he hadn't felt since his wife was alive. He had made his decision the moment he stood between them and the trappers. He had sealed it with his blood. Their fate was his fate. As the March sun melted the snow, the mountain began to wake up. The passes would soon be clear. One evening, Vavina looked at him. "The snows are leaving," she said. "It will be time for us to go." Elias felt a sharp pang of loss. The thought of the silence returning was unbearable. "Where will you go?" he asked. "North," she said. We will find our people. We must. It was their duty. He had no right to ask them to stay. This cabin was a fortress, but it wasn't their home. The day they left, the air was crisp and cool. They stood before him, ready for their journey. Lavina stepped forward and put a hand on his heart. "You are a good man, Elias Vance," she said. "You did not decide our fate. You shared it." He couldn't speak. He just nodded. One by one they came to him, each touching his arm. When it was Mesa's turn, she pressed a small, smooth object into his hand. It was a bird, carved from pine, its wings spread for flight. "For your ghost," she whispered, "so she does not fly alone." And then they turned and walked away. He watched them disappear into the trees. He was alone again. He walked back into the cabin. The silence was back, but it was different now. It was filled with the echoes of their courage, their kindness, their strength. He walked to the mantel over the fireplace. He gently placed the carved bird next to the faded photograph of his wife, a memory of a life lost, and a symbol of a life reclaimed. The mountain was quiet, but Elias Vance was no longer a ghost. He was its keeper. His grief was still there, a scar he would always carry. But it was no longer a tombstone. He had been a man waiting to die. But now, finally, he was ready to begin. What do you think Elias did next? If this story of survival and redemption moved you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more tales from the edge of the world.